Hi everyone, welcome to today's session. My name is Joe Yates, I'm the technical manager, so I'll be providing support in the background with some other members of our team. A really warm welcome to this session on co-producing food system maps using group model building. This session is going to be chaired by Cecile Nye of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine with a range of colleagues, and Cecile will introduce you all to those as we go along. Thanks very much for taking part in the Academy Week this year. This is the first parallel session of our Learning Labs. We really appreciate you joining us for this, and I hope you're looking forward to the week ahead. A quick reminder that if there's anything you need for the conference, Zoom links, information, you can find them all on the ANH Academy website under the ANH2024 tab. Before I hand over to Cecile to take the conversation forward, I'm just going to provide a few housekeeping notes, if that's okay. First, to let you know that the session will be recorded and it will be posted on the ANH website in due course, hopefully as soon as possible. Secondly, all participants have been muted on entry into the meeting. There'll be opportunities later to discuss and use the chat box and also use your microphone, but please introduce yourselves in the chat box, who you are, where do you work, what do you work on, just so we can all get a sense of who's here. If you can, then turn your webcam on. It's really nice for the vibe of the room, but obviously if you're struggling with connection or bandwidth, then feel free to turn it off so that you can participate. Finally, if you have any questions, please do use the chat box at any time in the meeting, including if you've got any technical issues. If you have got technical issues with sound, then just have a look at your audio settings and the internet connection first, but we've also found that just reconnecting sometimes to Zoom can fix the problem. But if you've got persistent problems, do just send me a private message, or we will get you fixed up. So without further ado and taking up too much more time, I'm looking forward to the session and going to hand over to Cecile. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Joe. Welcome, everyone. You're very welcome to our Learning Lab. And my role here is relatively easy, and that's just to introduce the team. And I'll start with the furthest away, who is Hala, who is from Lebanon, associate professor currently at the University of South Carolina. And so she's up very early, and so thank you very much for that. And Chaza Akik, who is an independent consultant in public health nutrition and is based in Beirut. And Reem Helou, who is a researcher working closely with Chaza and Hala, and who is also based in Lebanon, I think just south of Beirut, if I'm not mistaken. And then Natalie Savona, who's going to do the lion's share of the speaking today, who is based at a consultancy called Cordis Bright. And myself, Cecile Kanai, I'm professor of public health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And this is an equitable partnership between ourselves and we're all co-investigators on this project. And it's been, I think, a very exciting project, but a very challenging project for obvious reasons. And so in a way, this is a learning lab for us as well, because, and in a sense, you know, the whole funding around the amount of funding is very much about testing and validating and perhaps coming up with the answer of, no, this isn't right for this situation. But we're hoping that it will be, in the end, a project that does move forward this possibility of getting, you know, a participatory approach on a complex issue in food systems, and being able to provide tools which we'll demonstrate today, which can be used online to great effect. And so today, the topic is about using group model building to co-produce food system maps online. And food system maps, we're using that term in the broadest sense of the word. So ideally, this can be applied in any situation in which you're working. And should we share the slides? So that's us with our logos. Next slide, please. And our names and institutions in case you would like to contact us. Next slide, please. And so the learning objectives for today's session are about briefly introducing the project itself, which we are calling the CLOVE project. And then to become familiar with systems thinking. And that's really going to be through the demonstration of group model building. And to hopefully, if everything works, to test out aspects of group model building online using a tool called Kumu. And then to have a discussion and a brainstorm with any sort of ideas that you might want to bring to the table about research that you're doing or projects that you're thinking of doing, about how group model building might be useful for a topic or in different settings. So we are hoping that the session is as interactive as possible. And I should also say, please just jump in, just interrupt at any time if you have a question, because, I guess that's the point of the exercise. And if we can answer, we will. And if we cannot answer on the moment, then we will get your details and follow up with you afterwards. So next slide, please. Over to Shaza to tell us briefly about the project.
Great. Thank you, Cecile. Hello, everyone. Very happy to be with you today. So very quickly, we're going to go a bit, we're going to discuss the Imana CLOVE project. So I'm going to present that to you quite briefly. So the aim of our project is to apply participatory complex systems methods to characterize the informal and ad hoc food safety nets in Lebanon, and to identify the motivations and influence of large food, soft drinks corporations within that system. To answer that aim, we have 4 objectives, the first of which is to characterize the informal and ad hoc food safety nets, including the documenting the distributed foods. The second objective, Natalie, can you go into display mode, please?
Sorry, I think it's come out of slide. Has it come out of slideshow?
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't know what I did there.
That's fine.
Okay.
Oh, great. Now, the slide before, please. Perfect. Thank you. And our second objective is to analyze the role of corporate actors in informal and ad hoc food safety nets, how they influence them, and to identify wider implications of their involvement. Third is to demonstrate the value of employing participatory systems methods in crisis settings. And last but not least, to co-produce a toolkit of systems methods for crisis contexts. Next slide, please. Great. So why the focus on informal and unregulated ad hoc food safety nets? And we define that as local and international ad hoc food support initiatives that are operating without regulation. So it's important to keep in mind that this is a project that is funded by Imana, and 2 of the key objectives and the call for proposals was about systems thinking in complex and humanitarian settings. And the second one was to also look into commercial determinants of health. So we actually framed our proposal and this whole project around these 2 key objectives. And so in the context of Lebanon, the informal food safety net is unregulated. Just the slide before, Natalie, please. Yes, thank you. So the informal food safety net system itself is under-researched. The other aspect is we do not have a good understanding of the role of large food corporations. So we know that they are involved. For the Beirut blast that happened in August 2020, there was unregulated distribution of in-kind donations of breast milk substitutes, therapeutic foods, and commercial complementary foods. We also know that Coca-Cola, Kellogg's, and Nestle support the food banking regional network, which supports the Lebanese food bank, yet mechanisms of support are unclear. So really little is known about this unregulated food safety net assistance system, I would say, and we don't know a lot about commercial determinants of health. So these were the two cornerstones, I would say, for the focus of this project. Next slide, please. So to answer these four objectives, we started with a documentary review of published and great literature on formal and ad hoc food safety nets in Lebanon and the role of the food industry, and that was completed. Second is we conducted some structured interviews with stakeholders who are individuals in decision-making or responsive roles, whether operational, financial, and informal and ad hoc food safety nets for vulnerable groups. We call it in process because we would like to keep interviewing as much as we can, but we've had a good number of interviews so far. The third method is really what we're going to go through with you today, and that's the system mapping workshops that will be conducted using group model building with stakeholders in both the formal and informal food safety nets. And it's important to mention that these were supposed to happen in person, but given the situation in the Middle East, in Gaza, but also in the south of Lebanon, and the difficulties and the restrictions, I would say, for the team in the UK to visit Lebanon, we have decided to opt to move these to online workshops. But again, I mean, this is something we could also discuss a bit more if you're interested, is how are we, the recruitment process and how difficult it has been for us actually to bring together these stakeholders to conduct these workshops. So this is for our third. And our last method is to actually conduct sub-studies that comprise further interviews and documentary analysis to provide a detailed understanding of some of the stories, the factors, the feedback loop that will emerge from the group model building workshops, but also those initial stakeholder interviews that we've conducted. Next, please. And so this is the next slide, yes, this one, shows the complex web of food assistance actors. And actually, we have put this together, obviously based on previous knowledge of the food system, but also adapted to the Lebanese context, using both the documentary analysis and the stakeholder interviews that we have conducted. So you can see this is a quite complex web, and all we know so far is the what, so the who are the actors, right? But what we are also interested in and what we want to delve in, and where the group model building and the systems thinking will help, is the how are they interlinked? So I will move it, I will give them I will let Natalie take it from here. Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay. Sorry, I'm having a few difficulties with my screen, as you can keep. So sorry, Shaza, for messing around. So yeah, so we wanted to make sure that before we go into talking about doing group model building, doing system mapping, that we made it clear where we were coming from. And where we're coming from is using systems thinking. And systems thinking in many ways is common sense. It's become a bit of a thing, but it's actually, you'll see, we'll take you through it. And this drives our method of group model building, of what we also call system mapping. So when you're looking into very, very complex issues, what you're trying to work out is what's happening. So Shaza showed us that map of the food actors. And what we're also trying to get a sense of is, why is all of this happening, as she said? How are things happening? And so when you start to research things that are pretty complex, most of us have public health backgrounds in our team. So we're used to illustrating very complex things. Most of you who are listening, obviously, I don't know where you're from yet, but I suspect you're all working on pretty complex issues. Anything to do with food, agriculture, health is inherently complex. And what I mean by that is there are just lots of things going on at the same time that interact, and it's quite difficult often to unravel what's going on. So normally you're trying to research something, and on a certain level you're going, okay, well, what causes what? If I do A, what happens over here? But the reality is more like this. This is a beautiful illustration. I really recommend looking at this woman's website. I think she sums it up perfectly. You know, in an ideal world, we'd be going, okay, let's find the causal forces of ad hoc food donations by large corporations. Let's, you know, the most famous example of this is research done on obesity, where it's incredibly complex. So this is what we're dealing with. We're trying to make sense of all those squiggly red lines. And so what systems thinking involves by looking at this complexity is really taking into account that all these things that are going on are going to make an issue that's bigger than the sum of its parts. You can look at the different parts, and it's often very helpful to do so, but really you need to also take account of the whole. And in doing that, you look at the separate parts, but what you want to know is, how are they connected? How are they interacting? And by extension, feedback. If I do something here, any action I take will have some sort of reaction. So for example, one question at the moment that I'm looking to on something else is food banks. In Britain at the moment, food bank use is growing because of poverty. So let's give people food. Of course, that's essential. It's unquestionably the right thing to do. But if we keep doing that, what else happens in the rest of the system? Does it mean that the government feels slightly off the hook for dealing with poverty? So this is what I mean about relationships. How are things connected? How are they interacting? If we take action, what feedback are we going to get? And the other element that you try, although it's quite difficult to do when you're doing systems thinking or applying systems thinking to any project, is what's changing? Because if you think about it, things are constantly changing. Any action has some sort of reaction. And so you are trying to account for the fact that anything that happens will change over time. So what systems thinking does is it just gives us this way of, as this quote says, trying to unravel the complexity of causal forces, trying to unravel the way everything's connected and knocking into each other and affecting each other. So that's where we're coming from with systems thinking. And what we're going to be talking about mainly today is group model building, which, as I've said, can also be called system mapping. Group model building is a type of system mapping. And one of the reasons we try and do system mapping, as I said previously, things are very complex. There's lots of factors. They're all interacted, but also everyone has their different perspective. So you come into the room and you're talking to people about food assistance, and there will be some people who will say, I don't care about anything else. It is not my job to think about anything else other than ensuring that those people over there who are in need get some food. That's all they can see, because that is their job. And thank goodness for that. That's not a criticism of it, but that's also how human cognition works, isn't it? We can't possibly take account of all the factors involved in a complex problem. Our brains just can't do that. It would overload us. And this is an example here of you blindfold a load of people and you show them this huge complex animal, and they're going to see things from a different perspective. Someone holds the tail, they think it's a rope. And similarly, when we look at a complex problem, we will have our own perspective on it. And the group bit of group model building is bringing people together, getting people to see the issue in the round, see the fact that there are other perspectives. and take account of them in the work that they're doing. And that work that that we showed you before, the findings on the map of all the actors, that is an important part. Who is involved? What are their interests? It's all going to be different. And by doing group model building, you try to create some sort of representation of multiple perspectives. And so why do we do this group model building? Obviously, I've started to sort of suggest why we do group model building. This quote in the corner here on the bottom left, it's an organizing rubric. It just helps us organize this multitude of factors that's involved in this complex issue and a whole load of other things. So we do group model building, which like I said, is also called system mapping, just to slightly confuse things even further. It's also called creating a causal loop diagram. So we're creating a diagram of the causes. If I do this, how will that affect this? A leads to B, leads to C. But what we're also interested in is all the other things along the way. I'll illustrate that more in a moment. But you're trying to get to the causes of the causes. Just the process of bringing people together, getting all these diverse stakeholders, helps create a rounder picture. You can't ignore that bit of the system just because you don't know about it or you don't like it or whatever. We need to take account of the diversity of people and actions involved. And by doing so, we build this collective representation of it. And also in doing so, we think, okay, we can generate some hypotheses. You know, what's going on here? If we're doing this, this is going to happen here. We can generate hypotheses around what is happening and why, and what could be happening, and make sense of it all. And by doing so, the people involved see their role in the system. Okay, we're over here, but there are these people over here who are actually quite impacted by us. Or if we do this, this is going to mess them up. Or, that's going to enhance it. So everyone gets to see how they are part of a collective system. And building those relationships, they can collaboratively come together or not. I mean, this is another dimension of our work, is we're looking at, big commercial interests. What are those interests? And in the map, in the causal loop diagram, in the system map that we create through group model building, we literally will start to illustrate these connections and what's likely to happen. So that's where we're coming from with all of this. I'm just going to give you a little example. Cecile, would you like to do this? No. Okay, so Cecile and I worked on a project that was funded by the European Commission. It was called Co-Creating Obesity Policy with Youth. So we worked with 16 to 18-year-olds across 5 European countries in schools, and we did group model building with them. So we did system mapping with them. I'm conscious that I'm talking a lot, so please pop questions in the chat. Joe, anyone else, interrupt me if you wish, but we will have a moment for questions and answers in a bit. So we did group model building with these young people, and it was fascinating. So everyone kind of knows more or less what drives obesity. The simplistic attitude is people eat too much and they don't exercise enough. We all know that's more complex. Obesity is more complex. But what was fascinating with this is that we found that the young people we spoke to had very different views on both the research and the policy around obesity. And they had a lot of emphasis on their mental and emotional health. A lot of emphasis on how the structural environment, how the commercial environment affects their mental health, how social media affects their mental health, and how that affects their body weight. So you can see we've pulled out of this map on the bottom right a little feedback loop, as we call it in a system map. And feedback loops, if you can identify them, they're quite hard to do. You can see that they're sort of driving the system. They're like the engine of the system, where a problem can be magnified or dampened down, and also where you could perhaps intervene to help either of those, whichever's the most appropriate. So people are saying, stress, mental health affects their eating. affects their calorie intake, which is going to affect their body weight, which in turn affects their self-image, etc. So you can see how system mapping helps you break down these factors and how they're connected. There is a paper on that. If for anyone who's particularly interested, we will be sharing references at some point. This was another use of the system map that we did, which was probably one of the things that's got the most traction. And I'm giving you these examples because I think one of the things that people forget when they're discussing system mapping is why you bother doing it. It's incredibly time consuming. It's quite hard to do, but the rewards can be huge. So this is the same system map from Co-Create. And what we did was we plotted where colleagues who were doing different streams of the work had found evidence on obesity in relation to young people, and where there were policies related to obesity for young people. And where those are plotted, you can see yellow and pink stars on those factors. And obviously I'm quite familiar with this, so I can see it immediately. But if you look to the top right of the map, the purple zone, we found no evidence and no policies that directly associated stress, mental health, self-esteem on body weight like this. That's not to say there isn't any. This was done quite a few years ago now. Things have changed. But what I'm saying is you can create gap maps. You can see where there is evidence, where there's policy, where you could take action. So they can be a really useful way of grounding your work to explore further dimensions of it. This is another example. Many of you will know that that there is a tax on sugary beverages in England. And when it was first announced, that we said we'll have a sugar tax, and the very linear way of thinking is, great, there'll be a sugar tax, prices will go up, people won't buy so much, they won't consume so much, and on a population level, obesity will be reduced. Now, it doesn't take much, and I'm sure every one of you will realize that that's incredibly simplistic. Yet, it still prompted the a spokesperson from Coca-Cola UK to say there's no evidence that this will reduce obesity. And actually, what you really want to be thinking is in a more complex way. So the thread of ideas on this slide, some colleagues of ours did some work looking at this for the National Institutes of Health Research. And those green blobs from this slide are more or less represented in these ones here. And what you can see immediately is there's a whole load of other stuff going on that is going to get in the way of this linearity. And from a commercial point of view, that's a lot of lobbying, a lot of PR work, immediately companies lowering the sugar content so that when they've reformulated, they don't have a tax slapped on them. They'll advertise, there's loads of stuff going on that makes this very, very weak as an argument. And I think this complexity, this seeing it in the system map, is a really, really strong way of saying that you need to look at such complex issues around food, around health, around agriculture in this way so that you can see the complexity. And when we do system mapping, this is actually a photo from Co-Create from a few years ago now. We think it's a method that is really, really strong on many levels. And I don't know, again, obviously, what sort of work you are all doing, but I hope in this you can all see an opportunity where this might enhance the work you're doing, not just in academic research at all. I now actually work in a small consultancy where we do research and consultancy for the public sector, for charities, and we're using system mapping all the time. So it's absolutely not just an academic exercise. And the key thing is you get the people in the room to see themselves as the experts, and they identify factors relevant to them. So we saw with the young people, mental health, stress, super important in relation to body weight. And the whole method is actually called community-based system dynamics. It's meant to be an on-the-ground method, not, you know, up in academic institutions and very high flying and only academic experts at all. Far, far, far from it. These people whose backs you see in the photo are probably 16, 17, well, they are definitely 16, 17 or 18 years old. And they are the experts in what young people, you know, in what they see as the drivers of obesity. And again, in the group, I've done groups with commercial, but you have this shared sense of learning. And the way the sessions are structured is very, very deliberately engaging. And it deliberately has moments where people are working on their own, writing factors down. You'll see this in a moment where we demonstrate it, and where people come together. So even a quiet person at the back of the room who literally never says a word, they've written their factors down and they can have them represented on the map. So it's very equitable. It helps with good facilitation to sort of flatten power dynamics in a room. And by extension, it's very useful for sensitive topics. You know, I don't think it would take much stretch to argue that obesity is a sensitive topic. We weren't asking these young people, you know, what makes you eat more? It was like, what do you think are the, you know, as young people, what drives body weight for these young people? You sort of abstract the individual. And on the map, no one is identified. It's entirely anonymous. The whole point is it's a group effort. So I think as a method, it's really strong, and well, it's really strong. I'm aware that I might break for a second to see if there are some questions before I carry on with this next slide. Does Joe, Hillary, is now not a good moment to do that, or is there a preferred way of doing it?
I think this is a good time. I've been checking the chat just in case anybody has any questions. So far, they've been introductions, but if you want to put a question in the chat, I can always interrupt Nat and just jump in, or just jump in.
You're all preparing yourself. Ah, someone's raised a hand. Thank you, Teresa. Hi.
Hi. Yes. Thank you so much. This sounds really super interesting. How you are using, you know, system mapping within your area of work and the examples that you are presenting. I work for World Hunger Health, which is an organization that is aiming to address zero hunger, and we work within international cooperation and humanitarian action. And we are actually trying to employ system mapping for our programming. And oftentimes our programs, they span different kind of sectors and are quite broad, you know, bringing different areas kind of together and addressing, yeah, they are basically multi-sectoral. And I don't know, from our experience, it seems to be always a challenge. So to even engage with the participants or with the populations of interests, to get them to come up really with a system up, because there is like so many different variables and so many different factors that start coming up into play, into discussion. And actually what we have been really struggling with when it comes to system mapping is how to really scope out the system and set some boundaries before the system mapping exercise. I'm not sure whether you will talk about this at all, but I would find it super helpful.
Sure.
You know?
I mean, we do have, I'll talk about it now. It's you know, it's a good time. You know, the session is, you know, it's a learning lab. It's mainly for everyone here to get as much out of it. So yes, the plan towards the second half is to work through some examples and the sorts of questions you should ask when you're planning system mapping, because in my experience, there are several factors in the question that you ask. One is getting people to commit the amount of time it takes to do a proper system map. What I've often done these days is actually not follow the group model building method, but put together a sort of a sample map based on literature, based on views, and present that to stakeholders to either shoot down or to build. So that's one option. But it sounds to me like your question is more along the lines of thinking about the boundaries of the map. That is one of the hardest things to do. So what I would propose is that the people who are, in charge of trying to manage all of this, you either think about breaking it down. So is it actually most important that in this particular piece of work, we are thinking, I'm going to struggle here because I'm going to try and make examples from an example I don't know a lot about. So please do throw in and help me out here, Teresa. But I'm thinking, is there something in this where we need to be talking about, for example, similar to us, the role of the big multinationals in related to the issue that we're dealing with of hunger? Is that a particular topic? So you find these areas that are a little bit more manageable, a little bit more discreet. Because, I mean, just off the top of my head, this isn't my field at all, but if you're trying to think about world hunger, you could be thinking about everything in the world, the way the global economic governance operates, climate change, and it's too much. It's too much. So it's often helpful to break it down. The other thing is to, depending on who you're working with. So for example, at the moment I'm working with a big team of people, not just us, looking at homelessness provision in England. Okay, homelessness. Huge topic. Many different populations. We're trying to do homelessness and rough sleeping, which are separate things. And on an initial map that we were provided with, it had climate change and war and destruction linked to homelessness. And what we've done is recreate a system map where we've gone, these things are important. War and destruction in certain countries in sub-Saharan Africa is affecting housing in the UK, but we don't have domain over that. We cannot incorporate that into an examination of homelessness in England. So we park these things on the outside. One of the difficulties with using systems thinking and trying to do that is you become someone who thinks, but it's all down to climate change, or it's all down to global economic governance. And if I can't do anything about that, what's the point? Because you're trying to think about the whole system. But in order to do anything constructive and proactive, in my experience, it's always essential to tighten the boundaries around the system that you're looking at least in part. We can perhaps explore your example in more detail when we go into that other section, and you can say things to me a bit more rather than me trying to answer a question like this. But it is about breaking it down, being really tough about the boundaries of what you're looking at and what you have within your scope. Actually, another example, the people who taught Cecile and me group model building, sorry, Cecile, I've just seen your hands up, just one sec, told us about a story about looking at obesity in a very small rural community in Australia, a rural community. And they did a system map with loads of people from the community around the things that drove obesity. And one of the things that came up was Coca-Cola. And they said, we get that, but there's a real limit to how much influence we have on any of that. And therefore, we're going to put Coca-Cola outside of the boundary of what we can do. It might be that in some situations, you can do something about that. You make sure it's not sold in schools, for example. So there's no right answer, as you can hear. But you have to make some choices around that, depending on what you're mapping and why. Sorry, Cecile, I went on a bit there.
No. I think it also illustrates the challenge of doing exactly that. And in fact, on our project, we are having, very similar discussions. And I would add, and Nat did talk about that, and I would add and support the point that the core question that you are aiming to answer through system mapping is one that is particularly challenging, and really warrants time to spend around it and to test it. And so you were talking about programming, is that right? So identifying, so can you say a bit more about what that actually entails?
So I would say we have different basically projects and different programs working in different areas, yeah, and we also do system maps at different levels. Like we do it at the level perhaps, or we are attempting to do it at the level of portfolios. We are trying to do it at the level of single projects, for example. But it might be that one project is trying to address the impacts of on the population, the impacts of climate change, perhaps. I don't know. I'm just giving a bit of abstract example, but yeah, perhaps trying to address impact of climate change through, for example, I don't know, addressing governance and addressing somehow market value chains, and maybe say if it is a humanitarian context example, maybe trying to somehow deal with kind of shocks and stresses and community resilience to that. So perhaps this could be like an idea of like a project, but it's, as you can see, it still has like many different, it almost has like three systems on its own within that, that are linked by a broad umbrella of like climate change. Yeah, I don't know whether this gives you a bit of an idea of the kinds of project that might be, and a practical example. And I hope I am, by the way, not hijacking now your presentation a bit.
No, I think this is exactly one of the challenges, but that is very worth spending time on, because you then get a wealth of detail once you have identified sort of that key question. And one of the ways in which we've been exploring, because at a smaller scale, there are various issues that are coming into play in the question. And I'm sorry, Hala and Shaza, if I'm you jump in, if I'm not explaining this correctly, but my understanding from working with Hala and Reem and Shaza is that there are a range of different crises that are overlapping, that are interlinking, and that are also moving and dynamic. And so it's one thing, to draw a context, to draw a picture of what the context is, but it's one moment in time. And so to have that in the background is really useful for us, but to zoom in on what exactly is it that we want to be finding out. And that may be a question of looking at sector or issue by issue, and seeing how those things draw together, whether there might be connections between them or not. And I think the example that Nat will take us through both illustrates, the challenge of that, but also this question of, you've got the practical need of answering some questions. And for example, in your case, maybe moving forward a strategy at a programmatic level, and maybe understanding how those actors work together. But on the other hand, you want to be able to capture the bigger picture.
And the other thing I think that I should have mentioned is different types of mapping. So what we're talking about in this session is causal loop diagrams. So chains of causation. This triggers this, triggers this. But it might be that some of your work, you, Teresa, but also other people here in the meeting, actually needs more of a sort of conceptual map. So you know, in a causal loop diagram, strictly speaking, every factor on it should be a variable, should be something you can change. But it might be that you say, okay, we're doing, I mean, to use the example of Clove, you know, we're doing something on hunger in Lebanon. There's the Beirut blast. That's an event. It's not a factor that can be changed. And therefore, it might be that you want to do more of a conceptual map just to see the whole array of factors that affect something. And then you can zoom in and find what your questions are, because we'll talk about this. But causal loop diagrams, one of the hardest bits is finding the right question to ask in the first place. And that can make or break a project.
Nat, I'm just going to jump in. Thank you, Teresa. And maybe come back with your example when we're testing things out, and we can continue with that. There's a question from Reno, from the Philippines, and how can we introduce a new system to address poverty and traditional limiting beliefs in a local government unit that has shown resistance to previous mapping methods? Additionally, what strategies can be used to influence and encourage acceptance of these new methods within the community? That's a really good question. Nat, we can answer this now, maybe?
Yeah. Thank you for that. I mean, I hope that, you know, in each of these questions, there's something for everyone. I feel like there are sort of two questions in there, two key ones. One is more around the method, and one is more around how on earth do we make this world fairer, and how can this method do its tiny little bit to do that? I don't know if Marino, you want to speak or whatever. Please do if you'd like to, but otherwise I'll just I'll start with an answer. So I think what you're dealing with is clearly very, very difficult, very challenging. There's clearly political resistance. But one of the things that we found system mapping can be quite useful for is trying to illustrate a little bit of objectivity in a given problem. And what I mean by that is that you're not going into politicians and saying, you are unfair, you're not putting the money in the right place, this is all wrong, you know, you've got people suffering over here, because most politicians don't want to hear that sort of criticism. You know, that's just how things operate. But what you can do with system mapping, especially if you manage to bring in different perspectives, is illustrate an issue relatively objectively, and also illustrate potential solutions. I'm going to give an example which is probably easier to understand. So I was asked to do some work last year with a local government, with their public health team. And what they wanted to do was make sure that people who were coming to their area, who were migrants, from non-UK nationals, were not left destitute, penniless, homeless, all sorts. So they, you know, they wanted to look at the health of people who had no recourse to public funds, as they call it. And so we did a system map with loads of different people in the room, including the local government, including local migrant support groups, including charity organizations, schools, everyone involved with dealing with this population of asylum seekers and refugees in this area. And the thing that was particularly interesting politically was that this was a conservative council. And in England, what having a conservative council means, you tend to have much more sort of liberal right-wing policies, a smaller state, less provision, in extremis, very anti-immigration, okay? So that was the political context for doing this work. And what the public health team managed to do using the system mapping as one part of it. I'm not saying the system mapping, you know, was the answer and clinched it all. But what the system map managed to show was that there were many factors driving this potential of destitution for people who didn't have UK residency. But what we also managed to show was if there was legal advice given to them so they could speed up their processes, they would actually become very embedded, or had the potential to become embedded, productive members of society. And I use that word, it's quite crass what I just said, but I use it deliberately because there was an argument that we were able to make was, look, holding people off in this direction not only is morally questionable because we're leaving them, you know, destitute, possibly, you know, with real stress, but actually if we help them through the system with this legal advice, you know, they can get proper jobs, their children can enroll in schools with what we call a pupil premium, where the schools get more money for having non-English speakers and things. And actually they got the funding. They got the funding for this legal advice to be increased from a Conservative council. So I think that the system mapping would, it sounds, Reno, like it would just be one tiny potential thing in what's a much messier challenge, but it can create this sort of slightly more rounded view of an issue where you understand that there are politicians who don't want to do this, but you sort of show them all the other things. Obviously, I can't really answer the question about the difficulty of getting people to do system mapping because I'd need to know more to do so. But I think based on, you know, some of these ideas and the way you sell it to people, it can be a really strong method. It can be really casual. It can be, you know, you could do it sitting on the floor with bits of paper. Doesn't need online stuff. So there are lots of ways it can be used. So I hope that goes some way to contributing to perhaps inspiration, Reno.
And Nat, just to add to that, because one question as you've just noted now that Reno brought up was about this, you know, the issue of getting people to the table to begin with. And if you remember, what we found in the group model building with young people was that all of that period of negotiation to begin with and thinking, well, what is the win for them? What is the added value for them? Because, you know, they obviously, you know, unless they see the map that they've created, it's very difficult possibly, you know, for them to be thinking, well, what is in it for me? And so that was a useful exercise of thinking, well, what do you need in exchange? Is it to cover your time? What do you need in exchange? Is it to, and the young people and their teachers, one of the things that they could get in exchange was to use the group model building as a piece of homework, as an exercise that they could contribute to their learning. So it was built in, sort of baked into their curriculum, so that it wasn't extra time. It wasn't, so really sort of, you know, to go back to that group and to say, well, you know, in principle, there are many things that you could learn from it, but where could we meet you 75% of the way? And what would you need in exchange? Let me see if there are any other questions before we go on. The question at the end of the day in initiating the dialogue and introducing these methods, what's in it for me? But Reno, you are exactly right. And I think that's probably a universal question, you know, that most research participants have. And so along with the core question of what are we actually mapping, which Teresa raised in her example, as well as what is in it for participants? How can we make this a win-win? Very much with, you know, proper research methods in mind, to not take data without providing something in return and being quite transparent about that. Unless there are other questions, I'm being a terrible chair, we're just chatting. But this is, I think, really the best way to get people to jump in. Are there any questions before we go on with Nat? Sorry, okay.
Okay, so I mean, I just wanted actually to add to that last bit. The political will is really hard when you're working in, presumably most of you are working in relatively adverse situations. And that the system mapping is not going to be the answer for that. It's going to be the usual sort of stuff of networking, stakeholder building. But I think what the system mapping can do is you can start to generate a situation where people start to think, oh, hang on, I don't want to be left out of this. I don't want to be left out of this situation. You know, a politician needs to be seen to be caring and involved and wanting to see what the network around that particular challenge is. And therefore, I think, you know, I've been doing some work about partnership building in particular local areas across England, where we're trying to get local governments, local health boards, local grassroots organizations to work together around health equity. And there's a lot of, you know, there's a bit of conflict there, and there are different interests there. And yet everyone wants to be at the table because they don't want to be left out. And if this is, you know, we've had a bit of scratchiness in some of our group model building sessions where people, you can see them, they just don't like what someone else says. It makes them bristle. It doesn't fall within their view of this issue. But I think there's always a way where you can incorporate all of these views in the system map. But like anything, it's hard politically, and there are some situations where it's just not going to happen. And I certainly wouldn't ever want to say system mapping is the answer. It's just a useful tool. Right, so we're going to get much more practical after this slide. I just wanted to put up front, and perhaps we can revisit it at the end if it is at all useful. But, you know, why are we doing this? I've talked a lot about it so far, but just to have it in one place. We build a system map to use it. And one of the things you need to think about is what do we want to learn? How can system mapping help us? And some of the things that we have all done with system maps, those of us in the team who have used them, I'm sure those of you out there who have done system mapping have used it. You have this thing in front of you that tries to encapsulate the many dimensions of a given problem, a given challenge. And there are lots of different things that you can do with it. The first and foremost that system mapping or group model building was designed to do was to create these maps and look for what they call leverage points in the system. So identifying and prioritizing action. You know, where can we take action? Where is there a feedback loop that we could nicely break by one small action? And that would have a massive difference of rippling across the system. So the system map helps you see that. It helps you see if you take action here, what other factors might be affected. You obviously have to think positively and negatively. One argument I remember reading about against a saturated fat tax was that people would buy fewer fruits and vegetables and save their money to buy meat, even if it was more expensive. So you've got to think about possible actions and their consequences. The gap maps I've already demonstrated, where we did the gap map for co-create. Plotting the actors and the evidence and the policies you saw on that co-create map, we looked at the factors where there was evidence, where there were policies going on, you know, which by default shows you, or by extension shows you where there's nothing happening or where you might not know about it. And similarly, you could go, okay, the actors, who's responsible for each of these factors on the map? Who do we need to talk to about this? Who do we need to bring on board about this? And again, the actual process, you're starting to strengthen or build networks. And And the map, in many situations, I always imagine it, if we didn't work remotely, most of us, and I'm sure some of you don't, I always imagine it on the wall, a big copy of the map on the wall that you scribble on and you move things around and you kind of keep coming back to it and go, oh, that was really important to those people and we haven't done anything about it yet. So it's a guide. And you can continually adapt it. We're going to show you Kumu, the software online, where you can change a map every 5 minutes if you want to. And then that one at the bottom, I won't go into in too much detail, but there are other ways of assessing what's going on in a system. And one of the real founders of systems thinking, Donella Meadows, who some of you will have known about, she identified levels of the system where it's most effective to take action and important but less active, or less important. And there are ways of mapping that out on the system map that can be really useful guides for where you take action. So that's the uses. We're going to do a little activity now online where it would be really great to have some participation. But before we do that, are there some more questions or comments, or does anyone need a little break to grab a glass of water or whatever? Cecile, you look like you're about to say something.
No, I'm poised.
Okay.
We can, do you think we need breakout rooms? I don't think so. I don't think we need breakout rooms, no. No, because this is really about thinking in...
This is a sort of demonstration. It's not for us to actually do proper system mapping. We'd need more of your time for that.
But it should be as interactive as possible.
Oh yeah. I can't do this without you. I'm just going to be the technician now. Shall I just? Does anyone? No, everyone's very quiet, shy. No, okay. Okay, so we're going to do some system mapping now. I mean, like 15 minutes of it. So we're not going to create a proper system map. And actually, Cecile and I had an interesting sort of 10-minute chat. We had a big team meeting last week to confirm all our presentation and our slides. And we thought, right, we're going to do a system map in this session with you all on what drives the food assistance in Lebanon. We started doing it. It was really difficult. And we thought, okay, we've just made our point. This is really, really hard. And we need to think much harder about the question. We need to think about what else is going to go on. So given that
it's mainly that Ahala, Shaza, and Reem were not, for whatever reason, on that call. And we had to make a decision really quickly. And so they would have been able to answer the questions, I think. But so this is why we did check with you guys, but this is why we focused the question. To Teresa's point, this is exactly what we're talking about, that sometimes you need to pivot and sort of think, okay, well, let's just bite off one part of this at a time. Sorry, Nat, go on.
No. Thank you for saying all of that.
If you want to jump in.
I mean, just you know, I'm very conscious that Cecile and I are doing most of the talking, and this is very much a collaborative program where actually Shaza and Reem are doing most of the on the ground work, and it's solely because this session is about the system mapping, which was what sort of I was on board for, that I'm doing most of the talking, but I'm a bit self-conscious about that. But anyway, just to set the scene a little bit. Anyway, the purpose of this next session is not really the subject matter. It's to just demonstrate Kumu before, you know, in front of you. Is there anyone there who's used Kumu? Just put your hand up or thumbs up or whatever. And then Joe, maybe you could let me know, or Hillary. No? Okay. So we're going to do a little system map in Kumu. And what I would like you all to do, so everyone just have a little think. What would you answer to this question? If I asked you to come up with one thing that you think triggers the donation of baby milk substitutes, in emergency food assistance. Just write it down on, you know, on your notepad by you. Come up with maybe a few. What drives food assistance in the form of baby milk substitutes? Not necessarily just in Lebanon. And then what I've got at the bottom, sorry.
I'm just going to double check that everyone understands the question.
So drivers is like what triggers it, what makes,
Motivates.
why would people do it? Why do people donate?
Yeah.
Okay. And then just a little bit more detail on what I mean for the answers to the question is they are the things that help, you know, that trigger, that push donation, or maybe the things that get in the way of it. It's basically the help and hinder, what helps and hinders donating of these things. The why. Is that a question? No? Okay. And the other thing I want to point out, there's no right or wrong here. No one should feel they might have got this wrong. This in theory, we are creating a map of your views on what drives the donations of formula milk, baby milk substitutes. Okay, so when you're doing system mapping, it's not like you're looking for this really sort of precise, absolutely correct answer. Remember back to the young people. These are the things that we say drives body weight. That's what's important here. So it's your views. Try to be as specific as possible. So don't just say need. You know, whose need? Need for what? And like I said, we're not just doing this in Lebanon. Okay, so I am going to
So just a note while you get set up from Joe,
actually,
that if you would like to speak, just raise your hand and we can invite you to unmute your mic.
sorry, I'm just trying to find, there we go. I opened a window already. Share. Okay, can you all see? There's one that says testing at the top there. There's a little sea urchin picture. Is that all visible? Okay.
Yes.
So Kumu is an online, for those of you who don't know, an online free system mapping software. It's not the only way to do system mapping. Kumu hasn't existed for that long. System mapping's been going on for decades. You can do it with post-it notes, sticky notes on a wall in a meeting room. You can do it with torn off bits of paper that people write on and laying them out on the floor. Okay. System mapping can be done as low key or as techie as you want. This is just one way that we do it. It's really useful for online model building, which is what we're trying to demonstrate here. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but it's actually incredibly user-friendly. I've actually only been using it for the last year or so. Before that, I was using another much more clunky software. So it's really popular, Kumu. It's got great help function and support. So I'm going to set up a new project. I'm going to call it ANH baby milk test. Okay. There we go. So we have our blank page. Oh no, not quite yet. Okay. I'm not going to go into all the technical detail while I do this because we just don't have time. Also, I'm not the best place to do it. I have colleagues who are much more techie than me about this. Because also it's something you can practice yourself, but it's relatively simple to do. Would someone like to shout out a factor, or would someone like to type them, if you want to type them into the chat, and maybe
Shaza or Hala, do you want to jump in or just not to dominate?
Sure. From our experience, there's a perceived need that is accentuated by media around women who are desperate for milk, who don't have sufficient milk. There's also sort of a movement of solidarity that tends to sort of emerge in times of need and in times of crises.
Sorry, say that again, that last bit.
Sorry. Solidarity movements, sort of, we want to help. How can we help? What do people need? They need milk. So this idea that there is a solidarity movement for help.
Okay.
I'll let others jump in.
So there, in that, you said probably about 3 or 4 different things. So we're disentangling the story and the drive. No, it was perfect. It's like, there's this, so this happens. So when you're creating a causal loop diagram, you're always trying to think, okay, so there's the need. What drives that need? What does that need create? So you're looking, so the need is here. What drives it? What feeds out of it? So you're trying to look. Let me show you. Okay, so let's what we can add here is so there are people who are displaced, who become distant. I'm just making, but what I'm trying to do is show that. Hang on, I'm just going to add another one.
There are also some other ideas in the chat, Nat. Do you want me to read them out to you?
Just a sec. What I want to do before I do anything else is show you that we're starting to link things. I'll do one link and then we'll come to everyone else's. So there's actually a few factors between this, but when people are displaced, they don't have what they need. There's poverty. So that creates, so can you see at the bottom, displacement, crisis to need for formula. So there we go. We have our first causal chain. Okay, great. So yeah, if someone wants to shout out the stuff from the chat, and then we can talk or ask questions like, why did you do that? You know, that doesn't make sense to me, or whatever.
So some of the other comments in the chat are, a lot of people think baby formula is essential and think it is a humanitarian gesture to donate. So maybe essentiality of baby formula need.
What was the bit? Humanitarian
gesture to donate.
I wonder whether this falls under what you were saying, Hala, of the solidarity movements for help. Sunita, is that what you meant when you said a humanitarian gesture?
Sorry, I decided to get lunch in between. So yes, I think that's what it is. I think it's quite related.
Okay, so are you saying it's the right thing to do? It's like you can't argue with that. It's a gesture of humanity, I guess, and by extension, humanitarian. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So does it make sense that people are thinking it's a humanitarian gesture, so there become these solidarity movements?
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, what did the solidarity movements, so do they create the request?
I was thinking they create the donations in a sense, or they trigger the donations.
Okay. Do they provide them? Do they actually give the milk?
So
or
some of them
go?
Yeah,
okay.
Some of them would.
Okay. Let's move this over here because I'm not sure that's so good. Okay, sorry, back to someone in the chat.
So then there are some questions around, is there access to clean water? Is it sustainable? But I'm not sure. So are these questions that are posed, Hilary, in order for the decision-making to be made to trigger the donation? Is that how you were thinking?
No, I'm probably a little bit confused. And I think it's more about, it's this need to help, but it's the need to help, but not actually assessing the situation or the environment. So if they're providing all these breast milk substitutes, but actually it might cause more problems if they're not able to, if they're not able to actually make them up with clean water. And then it might be causing more problems with diarrhea, etc. So it was more about maybe wanting to help, but maybe a misunderstanding of the environment, or I don't know if that's correct.
No. It's there's nothing that's not correct on here. What the facilitator's role is to try and get each factor as kind of tight as possible. So in fact, I've already really made a mistake here. Not a mistake, but the true story is you don't have a displacement crisis, which creates a need for formula. The displacement crisis creates poverty, lack of supplies, which creates the need for formula.
Yeah, because I think my argument, and I've put it in there as well, is that, if people can continue to breastfeed during this process, is supplying all these breast milk substitutes going to lead to them thinking that their breast milk for some reason is not good enough, and then they're going to change, and then it's not sustainable, and then they can't breastfeed anymore. So I think it was a whole kind of chain reaction, that might occur.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is partly why we chose baby milk, is because there's the whole angle of like, well, obviously, as Sunitha said, it's the right thing to do. It's a humanitarian gesture. You have to do it. But then there's that whole other side, which is, whoa, hang on a sec. Do people have the water? Do they have sufficient formula to actually feed their children, or are they going to water it? And what does that do to a mother's milk in her breasts? So it's very complex. It's not just gosh, there's been a crisis, there's a Beirut blast, people need baby formula, here you go, job done. And I think everyone on this call has that sense that it's not like that. And what we're trying to show is that doing a system map helps you illustrate that complexity and all the possible things. So what I'm hearing, so hang on, I've been playing around a bit here. So what I'm hearing that you've said, Hilary, is that, we go from a need to the provision, but what the provision of formula does is it also I'm just trying to think, it impacts a mother's confidence to breastfeed, a mother's actual supply of breast milk. So there's a whole load of other things that start to make it more complicated.
So some of the ideas in the chat is a high risk cessation of breastfeeding as a result of this.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to put that over here. And so what we're creating some loops here. So the provision of the formula milk means that there's a risk of cessation of breastfeeding. So what I'm doing is I'm connecting them. You can go to here on Kumu and it says add a connection. And because I've clicked on here, it puts formula milk first. And then here I want to type in risk. So we've got, and it's going to link to that. And
so when you want to make a connection, you click on the factor.
You click on the factor that it's going from. So I clicked on provision of formula milk. And then you add connection. The shortcut is just a C. And it will automatically leave you a gap to type the thing you're connecting to.
So can I ask a question related to that? The message here is that provision of formula milk is increasing the risk of cessation of breastfeeding. How do we illustrate that? Is it through a dotted line to say decreasing the risk of? Or if we wanted to formulate it differently, so if someone said provision of formula milk is decreasing, so actually that was Hala or someone else's point, that it decreases confidence in breastfeeding. So could you illustrate that?
Yeah. So you saw there, I edited myself because I just put confidence in breastfeeding. Now we kind of know we were talking about a mother's confidence, but you should probably be quite specific because it might be that it's more to do with the health workers or something, their confidence to encourage people to breastfeed. So if you can be nice and precise, then that distinguishes things. So I've done mother's confidence. Oops, it's just updating. Okay, so things.
And there's a whole series of comments around support from government, health agencies, but also interest from the private sector and formula producers. So I don't know if you want me to call those out and for you to tell us how those might fit into this very complex map.
I fear we might, I mean, okay, thank you, Hala. So we've got 40 minutes left, okay? And our plan was to spend just about 15 minutes showing you Kumu. Because I think there is it's really interesting, but there's a slight danger we get too much into the subject matter here.
Mm-hmm.
When the point of this exercise is to just demonstrate how you start system mapping. So we could take a vote, but let me, so we've got 40 minutes left, and the aim for most of the session was to do a little bit like we did earlier with Teresa and Reno's questions, and to have someone else share a topic. So one of the things we said we wanted to get people to do was to come to the session with an idea of what you wanted to discuss, what you wanted to map, and we could help you think through how to pinpoint the question. So I would argue that the Kumu element is something you can play around with in your own time and get tutorials on. But it's not my session, as in we want you to get out of it what you want.
But Nat, I think it would be really useful to, this is just an idea, but maybe we could have a blank page where we use Kumu, because visualizing exactly what you've done here, sort of capturing people's ideas, could be a really helpful way, and as you were saying, you can just sort of play around with things and people can speak up.
Yeah, I mean, we can do either. We could do that, but I feel that given that we asked people to come along with an example of something they would want to discuss, I think one of the places where people take shortcuts is really thinking about what they're mapping and why.
Yeah.
The mapping bit is hard, but you just kind of get down to it. So I don't think, I mean, does anyone just hammer away in the chat, people, of what,
So let me just jump in. There are comments. So I would like to know what one does once we have the causal loop diagrams, which tend to be complex, other than describing the complexity. Does it help to assess where the system could be disrupted positively? That's a really good question.
Okay. I think that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Is everyone happy? I mean, I know there are a lot of you here and everyone's going to have different points of view, but I think there were two main purposes from the learning element of this session.
Should we answer that question?
Yeah. But I think one of them was give you a quick look at Kumu and a way to map and do it online. But I think the real meaty bit is that sort of question. Like what, why would you do system mapping? How are you going to help identify where to take the actions? What do you map? And I think these sorts of questions, yeah, Joe, does that sound good to you? Okay.
I could jump in from our co-create example, Sunita, where
So do you want to say the question again?
so the question was, I would like to know what one does once we have the causal loop diagrams, which tend to be complex. Other than describing the complexity, does it help assess where the system could be disrupted positively? And so I'll just jump in for 1 minute to tell you exactly, we had exactly this issue. So we had 230, something like that, young people from 5-6 countries. Natalie actually led the integration of all of those maps into one overview map that was explaining sort of the experience of young people on this question of what they thought drove adolescent obesity, their experience of it. And so the next stage was to start to look for what Natalie identified or spoke about as feedback loops or stories within the picture. So where were there places where the arrows were sort of pointing to each other, where we could, sort of zoom out and see, well, it does this, but it also does that. And what are the factors that are coming in to support a system that is, or to support a story that is sort of strengthening a bad pattern, strengthening, for example, isolation of young people in their rooms on their screen. And where is it that we could actually break those? And so actually taking that out from, zooming out and drawing those individual loops, those individual stories, was a very useful way of identifying those places in the system which could be opportunities for either going back to them and saying, how does this resonate with you, and what might be some of the solutions, or coming up with the solutions that they suggested. And Natalie, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so from in the sort of system dynamics tradition, which this comes from, originally people would do these diagrams to then quantify them and create simulation models. Cecile and I don't do that bit of it at all. But what that helps us remember is that we are looking for where there are things going on that are driving the system. Like I think I used the word earlier, the sort of engines of the system. And the places where those are most likely to be are the feedback loops. So when you illustrate, like you say, Sunita, you're representing the complexity, which in itself can be surprisingly powerful in terms of helping people not to think in a linear fashion. So although you could say it's just an illustration of the complexity, that in itself, in some situations, is really important to show people that it is complex, that you can't just do one little thing here and it will change everything. So illustrating the complexity in itself can be very powerful. But in terms of where you can disrupt the system, the feedback loops are the most likely candidates. So where things are really driving the issue or undermining the issue, is there somewhere we can come in and tweak one bit that could have a cascade of potential impact?
Yeah, and just to continue just a few seconds on that point, had we had interviews with young people to ask them what it was that was driving adolescent obesity in their views, they may have said, well, lack of opportunity for physical activity. And we may not have, dug deeper in that or in a focus group to get to but what is driving that lack of opportunity? Is it that you don't have access to green spaces? Is it that, you are doing something different? And the fact of asking that question meant that that story that includes the isolation and loneliness and whatever explains visually, because we've asked the question, why is it that isolation is an issue for adolescent obesity? And we did that, and we got to the story about screen time and social media, and the fact that young people were saying our environment is online. Our environment is not a park. It's not, what you see in the literature. It's we live and function online. And it reframed in many ways what the system was, talking about that initial question of the boundaries. It got us thinking very differently about where to start, or what to research, what to do in terms of interventions. I'm just looking at so there's another question from Reno, and I will put that out to the universe, i.e. Nat, because I'm not entirely sure how to answer it. Regarding transformative food systems, considering its vast scope across the entire across the entire food chain, where do you believe is the best starting point for system mapping? Additionally, do you have any recommendations for approaching this mapping process? Reno, did you want to say more about this question?
I can make a start on the answer.
Okay.
Yeah. I think what I would say in answer to that first bit of, where do you believe is the best starting point? The best starting point is really driven by what you're trying to find out. Why are you mapping? In fact, I think I had a slide on that. Things to consider when you're doing mapping.
Yes, hello.
Hi, Reno.
Okay, so I think I already fixed my mic.
Okay.
Okay. So yeah, thank you so much for that. I just want to be specific in my question, because here in the Philippines is most probably food systems. It's not quite. It's not new, but yet it is still young in the engagements, in the dialogue here in the Philippines. So because nobody, one of the problem also, I think, in different governments, that uh, governments are working in silos, so they are having a hard time talking to each other, or even interconnecting their policies with the food system. So right now it is a new advocacy, my advocacy here in the Philippines, in starting the dialogue of each government agencies, and also from the community. So the question, going back to the question, is what's in it for us in the Department of Agriculture, Department of Health, Department of Science and Technology. There, that is the very core question when it comes to putting them on the table and start talking. And what do you believe is the very starting point, because it's a vast cycle, or it's a vast chain, the starting point, or how can we make them a unified dialogue to identify the starting point using these methods? And with this kind of different kind of mandates and policies, what are your recommendation to have a unified process in initiating system mapping?
Thank you. No, it's useful to have a bit more of your thinking on that. So I think it still comes back to, what do you see that you can get out of using a system map? And from obviously, I understand so far very little, even though you've explained it. But what I'm understanding, or what I'm hearing, is that on a certain level, you want to have an idea of how every single, even government department has some connection to your topic of interest. You mentioned health, etc. So it might be that in the first instance, it's a case of creating more of an actor's map or conceptual map of the role of every single government department in relation to the issue. A classic example, sorry, I keep coming back to obesity because it's the one I've had a lot of experiences in. You know, in the past, town planning would never see themselves as remotely related to someone's body weight. It was like, that's health. You know, why would we be around the table to talk about obesity? But actually, green spaces, how easy it is to walk somewhere. You know, there are some cities where it's virtually impossible to walk anywhere. You have to get a bus or get in a car because there's big roads and it's dangerous. So town planning is really important. So if in the first instance, you just want all government departments to see that they have some stake in this, in the first instance, you would draw a pretty broad map. You know, so in relation to, it would help, tell me the exact sort of nature of what you're working on. Is it sustainable agriculture, or what's a kind of good way of summarizing it?
Yeah, since one of the problems in the policy making, especially in the food system, in formulating policy, is there are gaps of the policies as science and technology innovation as its backbone, or its supporting, because since we already have since the government agencies are working in silos, they have different policies with specific jurisdiction on their mandates. So that is one of that science, innovation, and data research should be the backbone of policies, not just because you are mandated by the Constitution to create such policies without consulting or without backing it with data. So
okay, so
yeah, that is
sorry.
yes, sir.
It sounds like in the first instance, you would want to create a very broad system map of the role that all the government departments play, to just have them see their role in the system. You all have a role. The homelessness example I mentioned that we're doing for this particular government, national government department, they very much want to get other government departments to see their role in it. What is the role of the prison system, the criminal justice system? You get people leaving prison, and the chances of them becoming homeless is much higher than anyone else in the general population. You get people in mental health care who struggle to find a tenancy in a somewhere to live and then to maintain it. So in other words, health and the criminal justice system affect the homelessness system. So it sounds to me like in the first instance, that's the sort of connections you need to be making so that everyone can see they have a stake in this issue. And then what you can do is you can hone in. So in fact, we've just been in conversation with this government department in the last week. They are asking us to do a deep dive into the relationship between the criminal justice system and the homelessness system. So we will create a much more in-depth system map of that. And that partly comes all the way back to Teresa's question. Sorry, Cecile, go.
No, I'm being a terrible chair, and these are really, really good questions, but I wanted to give others, I just wanted to get through a couple of other questions. That one of them is a bit more technical. So while we do system mapping, how do we determine the relationship between each factors? Is it based on literature or empirical analysis? Also, can we visualize the weight of the relationship in the mapping to see one factor has more influence than the other? This is a very good question.
Great questions. Do you want me to answer that? Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So, again, I don't mean to be evasive at all, but it kind of comes back to why you're doing the mapping. So with us doing the mapping with the young people around obesity, we wanted their perceptions. We didn't want to know whether there was evidence on the relationship between time spent on TikTok and body weight. We wanted them to give us an idea of whether they sensed that connection. So we didn't want data in that instance. We wanted young people's perceptions. Young people's voices were very quiet in research on the drivers of obesity. And so you would need to work out whether you were eventually going to do some simulation, in which case you want it to be much more quantitative based, making sure it's very strictly variables, factors that are in the map. And then in terms of being based on the literature or empirical analysis, that's sort of an extension of what I've just explained. Some people do system maps entirely based on literature reviews. What does the literature say about X? Ah, okay, it says this, and it says this causes this, and this causes this. In other words, you could do an entire system map sitting at your desk based on evidence, on the literature. In fact, when we next do our system map on the criminal justice system, one of the first things we're going to do is a rapid evidence review on what is out there on the relationship between being in the criminal justice system and being homeless. So it comes to what you're doing and why.
And that allows for a gap map, as you illustrated earlier.
Yeah, and yes, there are ways of visualizing the weight, but in order to do that, you would need to have quantified things. So again, it comes back to the sort of system map you're doing in the first place.
Another question is building on Sunita's question. If when a positive disruption takes place, what then? Do you constantly update the map? Is there a way to make it dynamic? And you answer that, and then there's another follow-up.
Yeah. So I guess it depends how you want to use the map in the work that you're doing. So like I said, I kind of have this lovely old-fashioned idea of it being on the office wall and us scribbling on it and things, which of course doesn't translate to a really neat map. But yeah, in Kumu and any other software that you can use, you can update it. You can create versions, like this is showing the system today, this is showing it in a year. It's the sort of thing you might want to do, especially if you're doing an evaluation, you know, what's changed throughout the system based on this particular intervention. It might be that all you did was use the map as a starting point and maybe a reference point. Oh, okay, we did this intervention here. Oh, we didn't think it was going to affect this bit of the system, but it did. In which case you don't change the map. It was just an initial tool to help springboard the research that you were doing. And your follow-up question about have you ever linked multiple maps to create a mega map, or does that defeat the purpose? I don't think it defeats the purpose. I've only ever gone the other way, gone from outwards on a map to zooming in. But there is definitely a strong argument for looking at how different systems are interlinked. That's probably technically a really hard piece of work, because I doubt that, you know, these little bits of the map would nicely interlink. You'd probably have much more mess. But yeah, it's certainly something to do.
But having different groups answering the same question, you can bring the maps together.
Oh, yes. Sorry. Yes. If you've got the same question, so like we had the 5 countries in Co-Create, each system map of what the young people saw as the drivers of obesity, and we merged them entirely, but it wasn't bringing 2 related but different systems together. But yeah, I've done the same for this piece of work we're doing, looking at the partnership working, between local government and health boards that I mentioned. We did it in 5 different areas, and we create a merged map, a blended map, to represent the issue.
So there's the last comment, the last point from that comment that was reflected in a follow-up was about the value of system mapping being as much in the process of co-creating and of creating dialogue as it is a creation of the map. And I think we've certainly seen that in the examples that we've been part of, that the networking and the getting people in a room together, even virtually, of dialoguing around a question inevitably builds those links. And I'm just coming back to Reno's point about the fragmentation of actors in the food system. And by the way, Reno, what you describe is very similar in, here in the UK. I mean, it's sort of a universal problem around food and nutrition, that there are often actors, in different pockets. And so, yes, I would, oh, that's it. No more questions to go. We still have, one message. Sunita.
Yes.
Do you see danger of very complex map actually making policymakers weary? They usually want simple answers. How did you communicate complex set of links and potential actions to policymakers?
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
A minister especially just wants his researchers to go, here, this is what you need to say. This is the answer to homelessness. Go and stand up in Parliament and say, this is what we're doing. We're not actually working with the ministers. We're working with the civil servants. I think it's about, it's all in the marketing, as I call it. How you sell this. You say, look, what you are dealing with is a very, very complex problem. Trust me that by looking at it in this really complex way, we can distill it. There's a brilliant, brilliant TED talk that illustrates that. I'll find it and put it in the chat in a minute when I'm not talking. But by illustrating the complexity, only by acknowledging it and accepting it, can you then start to distill it. It's a disservice to any complex issue to kind of go, forget the noise, forget the mess. Let's come up with one nice, neat way of looking at it. But you're right. Policymakers generally want something more simple. What we're finding with the homelessness work is that the actual policymakers, the civil servants, want to see the complexity, want help looking through the complexity in order to get to the simplicity. There's nothing simple about it, but in order to distill answers. Okay, we're putting millions of pounds into this particular area of homelessness, but it's not actually making any difference. Why is that? We can look across the system map. It's because there's so much desperate need for temporary accommodation, all the money's being used up. So actually we need to look at what we're financing. So these policymakers are actually quite liking seeing the complexity, and they get it. They really get it. And while it's messy, they kind of welcome the opportunity to have the mess appreciated and considered rather than pretending it's not there.
And that, in a way, I mean, along those lines, often we can be quite, in the research community, we can be quite sort of, not dogmatic, but very, the evidence says this, and this is the direction we need to go in. And in fact, we had a discussion, around our project about making sure that me in particular, I'm the one who does research on the commercial determinants of health out of all of you. And it was really important to sort of set the, to remind myself to go in with open eyes. And in fact, this question, we could go back to that question that we gave as an example, what are the drivers of donations of baby milk? And it's, what I am learning through this project is that the system mapping is providing an opportunity to illustrate both the things that are absolutely necessary, but that are maybe not what we consider good practice. And Shaza, do you want to talk about our, I'm putting you on the spot, but we had a real eye-opening discussion with the clinical dietitian at one of the public hospitals who was saying, well, I don't want to dominate me. Okay. So we were saying, bad formula and this and that. She said, look, it's not great, but for reasons that you don't understand. The reason it's not great is because we're getting donations for, by, a company, but those donations, they're good, but they're about to expire. They're about to expire from 2 months from now. So on the one hand, I, as the head clinical dietitian in this public hospital, absolutely need these products because we have malnourished infants and malnourished toddlers. And so the alternative is that I go to the kitchen and I make those products that could be the difference between life and death of a child. I remember her, I could visualize her, in the kitchen weighing up the thing. She said, I'm the only one here to do that. So the negative or the less positive side of that is that I will give this product, which was about to go off. And I know that a mother is going to use it for as long as she can. And it might go 6 months, it might go, so there'll be misuse of it. And that's just one of the risks to take, but it's either that or nothing. Shaza, am I explaining that in the right way? And we both came out and we sat in the car and we thought, this is exactly, why this is important. Because if you ask someone, they'll say, no, baby milk, not great, you need to be breastfeeding. But actually, there's a much more complex story in this particular case. And to be able to link those various things means that we're not missing that complexity. And we are making sure that that person's voice is captured in the picture of what is happening in that specific context.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really good other dimension to the baby formula map, isn't it? The complexity of it all. There's another question from Peter here, a more technical one about, doesn't group model building also start with a more structured approach towards identifying seed variables by constructing an interrelationship diagram or similar? Absolutely, Peter. There's a very there's a pretty standardized way of doing group model building. There's papers on it, books on it, there's resources online. What I've found is that often in research, we end up having to cut corners a bit because of the time people can offer us, because of the setup. But you're absolutely right. Proper group model building, you spend a lot of time thinking about the seed variables. So, what is it that we are mapping? I guess that's a much more precise, accurate way of describing what I was saying. Like, we really need to look at what are we trying to get to the bottom of here? What is the seed question? What is the seed variable? And in some projects, you have that time, you have that opportunity, you have the funds, the resources to do that. You'll also get people who will happily spend, 3-hour sessions in a room with you to go through it all. And sometimes you won't. And therefore, that's when the pragmatism kicks in and you think, okay, hang on a sec, what can we achieve? Is that still useful? Can we do it like this? That said, from an academic point of view, I think it's fantastic that things have been standardized in group model building and described, because you do need that academic angle of replicability, reproducibility. You know, could someone else come up with more or less the same thing? So yeah, it's always a case of balancing your priorities, pragmatism with what's, more strictly speaking, the right way to do things.
There's one last point from, or the last point in the chat from Teresa. Sometimes the same system may look differently from different groups of stakeholders' perspective. And that's very true. So yeah, I think the truth is really sort of the eye of the beholder. So inevitably, it's a little bit like the exercise of interviewing or other qualitative research, of really checking one's biases and prejudices and going into this exercise. Biases, prejudices, and interests. What's my interest in, in getting this done? So, but that also means that, you'll get different maps on the same topic, with different individuals, and that's a wealth as far as I'm concerned. I don't know what you think, Shazan and Nat. We have 3 minutes left, and I wonder, how do these things usually finish, Joe?
Just by saying thanks to everyone for coming, basically, and I can direct people to where they find more information. But if you are wrapping up and you're concluding, then it's fallen to me to say thank you so much to Cecile, Natalie, Shazza, and Hala for organising this. It's been really interesting, fascinating to think about how you embrace complexity and the sort of benefits that brings, especially from understanding different people's perspectives on a system, and how as you said, Natalie, that so many of the problems we try to address, especially when it comes to public health issues and sustainability issues, are not linear, and